4 determined secondary history teachers from around the country head for Ofsted HQ. They've got 20 years teaching experience between them and a whole lot of questions about the business of inspections. Time to turn the tables on top history inspector Paul Armitage.
Which is one reason why history, secondary history, is one of the best taught subjects.
The first issue under inspection is self-evaluation.
Self-evaluation is something which they always feel somewhat uncomfortable with, and I think all heads of department do find that somewhat uncomfortable, because I think they find they have many pressures, many things that they feel they have to do, and I think they often feel that the process of self-evaluation is actually taking them away from what they see as their core activity. By making self-evaluation the essence of Ofsted, in effect, what's been good practice in a number of schools, probably for the last 10 years, is having to come through, and it's having to be a process which people are going to have to address.
I'd be a bit concerned if you felt that you had to do this, you had to self-evaluate. I mean, presumably, I mean, you've always wanted to know how well you're doing. You've always had all sorts of thoughts and all sorts of evidence coming in.
What I would say is, it's a process which you do, and I think to some extent when you do it, it's actually revelatory, and to some extent that is on what you base your future plans.
As a middle manager, how do you feel about managing the actual Ofsted inspection?
No, I don't think you should be talking about managing the Ofsted inspection. Aren't we supposed to be talking about managing self-evaluation?
Absolutely, but within a context in the background there's still this managerial function we have to fulfill, and I don't think we can get away from it. You're completely right that what we're trying to do is develop an evaluation system for whole school development, regardless, for ourselves, yes, regardless.
And Ofsted will just
come in and inspect you.
Occasionally. Yeah. Well, in the case of history, it would be occasionally. I think we need to be careful what we're saying here.
Right.
There is a 3-year cycle for whole school inspections, but for history departments per se,
right,
you may get seen rarely.
Is there an emphasis then on core subjects ahead of non-core subjects? So in every 3 years, or is it very arbitrary?
Subjects are the same.
Spread across all
subjects are the same. But clearly, on a full school inspection, I'd be looking at the whole school self-evaluation form before I come in. What are perhaps some of the weaknesses, potential, and what are some of the strengths that we need to look at, which would be worth looking at? And I'd be highlighting those, which may not take me anywhere near history.
Self-evaluation, can probably veer from one of two things. One is the patting yourselves on the back and saying how wonderful you are. The other is everything's absolutely dire, and what have I done in my job for the last 2 years? And I think that is the difficulty.
You do have to be blisteringly honest, because the critical question is, how do you know?
No, absolutely.
And what's your evidence? And I agree, it is because that critical bit where you get to leadership and management, and you have to say, am I outstanding? Am I very good? And we're all naturally modest, so we probably, I think we're not modest. And it is. I know it's difficult,
but there are levels of honesty.
It's everybody self-evaluating within the department.
Absolutely.
And again, them, being blisteringly honest. I did this well. I don't do this well, and so on. The critical thing in future will be, where's the best place to go for evidence. Now, in theory, it's actually not to go into a lesson.
You have said that Ofsted is not dictating that the responsibility for preparation is devolved into departments, but it is happening in schools. So the data gathering and everything else is happening in such a way that it's being devolved to departments. For people that have never done this before are now finding themselves in an extraordinarily important position. They sense that if I haven't done my self-evaluation correctly, and I don't do well in my department, in my history department, and my history department is selected for this short inspection, then that reflects very badly in the school, because the school is then judged on the results of my inspection. And
I can only...
those anxieties can't go away.
I can only reassure you, look, we're all learning, and it's inevitable that there are going to be some written self-evaluations which are better than others. But the written self-evaluation actually may not be a reflection of the real self-evaluation that's going on in the school anyway. So we must see through the bit of paper.
The thing I'm concerned about in terms of learning is a notion that it isn't still just about learning. There's an element about what good teaching is. And, you know, the notion of prescription, the notion of the three-part lesson is something which I think uneases a lot of teachers.
But I think Paul's very much saying you're asking people to be courageous, and is there this point, and I think this is the key point, that then that has become constraining, whereas in point of fact there's so much good history teaching going on that just can't be defined, as you say, by someone going through a set of levels to say, if I do this, which, you know, I will be a level such and such, which can turn into, unfortunately, colouring by numbers and rather than real learning.
There's this idea that if I'm not doing my three-part lesson plan, then I'm only going to be getting a satisfactory. But clearly this is not what you're saying at all.
We must get away from that. We really have to ask ourselves, well, now, shall I go into a lesson? And if so, what's it going to tell me? Now, that teacher might be very nervous and do the worst lesson they've ever done in their lives. Well, so what? You know, what does it tell me? What I really do need to know, though, is what the quality of the learning is like normally. And what evidence am I going to look at?
We identified that boys was a serious issue in our school, and as a result of that, we've kind of done a lot more kinesthetic learning. Multiple intelligences have been taken on board. We've restructured the way we plan our lessons. I don't really understand how I can say doing this has helped increase attainment in a kind of tangible way.
Certainly the inspections that I've done have been really quite a rich professional dialogue. I've really enjoyed them. There was one, for example, I went to school last week. You're right, and the school was right to concentrate on learning. I mean, we didn't really talk about teaching, we talked about learning. And we had the opportunity to discuss the sort of things that you're raising. What we're most interested in is achievement. We've got this section of the self-evaluation form which is standards and achievement. Yeah, standards are important. I don't want to imply that they're not. But what's even more important is the achievement, the progress that children make, and how you know what that progress is. So, I mean, we do need to have some sort of hard evidence to say, yes, we're having an impact. Now, whether overall that's something like looking at point scores, Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4, or whether it's actually much more subtle in terms of some sort of progress indicator, you know, I'm open to suggestion. You're looking for evidence that they've understood the knowledge.
And there's conceptual development too.
And that they have conceptual development, they've deployed their skills. Something as prosaic as marking, which inspectors always love to comment on, you know, and so on. It is important, the marking. I think children marking themselves is very important. And it's also important for teachers to mark. But then the question is, how do you mark? And I do think it's important to mark in terms of the objectives, which takes us back to the strategy of making the lesson. What was this piece of work all about? Why were we doing it? And how well have we done in meeting those objectives?
Absolutely, because assessment can only be truly formative if it addresses any issues or shortcomings and then alters the teaching and learning to progress it. And you clearly can't do that by simply taking books. And often you can't do it by just marking grades down or leveling stuff. There has to be a much more specific dialogue so that there's a change from the older work to the newer work that's coming forward.
I mean, when you're marking a piece of work, then it's at what point you're turning around and actually saying, well, what am I marking this for? Well, you know, what am I testing here? But I think that's at the point where you're turning around and saying, when Ofsted would arrive for a one-off lesson, you can make lesson objectives clear in terms of where you're going with this piece of work. And you said the best part of dialogue would be sitting down and saying, you know, what are you doing over the next 4 or 5 weeks? What are your objectives here for this piece of work? And then you've got a wonderful, as you said, dialogue that can be informed and be positive on both sides.
If we talk about changing school cultures with regard to things like formative assessment, if you went in and you saw a school that actually had restructured the way it sets homework, restructured the way it assesses, and you say, instead of having homework due every single week, are now the whole school policy, if we're going to formatively assess or make an effort to formally assess well, we're only going to mark one major piece this term and maybe 2 minor pieces. Do those sort of things enter into a review?
I mean, I'd be thoroughly, very, very pleased that they were onto the issues. I mean, they may not have solved them. In fact, it's very unlikely they would. But actually, though, can I throw it back to you and say, sure. Because you see, I mean, we're still talking about Ofsted and that, you know, that day when Ofsted comes in, and as I say, Ofsted isn't going to come in to a large number of schools, certainly not for history. So it's a question: would you feel it impressive? Well, and how would you rate yourselves if you were doing that?
It's a valid point. Yeah.
Can I just also say, though, just a word for summative assessment?
Well, not that enough has already been said about it.
Which I'm particularly, and I I suppose it is summative assessment if I'm talking about achievement, this notion of value added. I think that is incredibly important, that you have the basis to reflect back on the performance of given cohorts.
Absolutely.
And groups of children within cohorts. I know it's and that is statistically based. I don't think one should be ashamed of that, provided, of course, we say, well, it's data, it's evidence. It may not tell the truth, so we don't just necessarily take it at face value, but it is actually a very incredibly powerful trigger.
I think the problem there may be, though, that the levels have come to try and fulfil that purpose as well, that you're summatively, whereas at the end of Key Stage 3 is the only time really, if you look to the strategy, that we should give a level, and people who break things down into 4A, 4B, 4C are going to find that their lives become increasingly difficult, because if senior management then pick up on the fact that you write on report a level at, say, the end of year 8, and then if they added those up and divided them by the number of students, and they would be unhappy that they've only gone up a third of a level, I think you're looking in the wrong place for some summative assessment, because the levelling process was hopefully there for the formative side of what we've been talking about. So summative in what way is the question.
And with the levels you get various tensions, because senior management want you to report and so they can show progress, even though conceptually the leaps don't happen in 1 year, or certainly not in 1 term. And at the same time, basing value added on English Key Stage 2 and then our Key Stage 4 results, English isn't the same as doing history. Should we be basing it on the APS in general? Should we then be target setting Key Stage 4 based on their Key Stage 3 APSs? Because history summative assessment levels count for anything. From your point of view, what would you want to see?
I don't know is the answer here, because I think it's the stage we're all at the moment, and I'm being very honest, that I see different systems in schools, or no systems. And more often than not, no systems or developing systems. You talk about levels, but I suspect, well, if you're going to look at Key Stage 4 compared to Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 2, well, we can't use levels, we've got to use probably point scores.
I'm a little worried about the future of history in its place in the curriculum. I've been hearing about these 14 lines of learning, they're vocationally oriented, and there doesn't seem to be a place for history.
I think we will be giving some fairly strong advice as to how we think the curriculum should develop to the QCA, and if they ask, to ministers and their officials. We've consistently said in successive annual reports on history that children's knowledge is extremely fragmented. Like you, we are concerned about the way in which, particularly the thrust towards vocational education, is putting a pressure on history, and there is this debate, this critical debate about, well, how important is history in the curriculum?
There are quite diverse ways of approaching the subject. And I'm not sure we've come to any sort of clear conclusion as to which we all prefer. You have the ability to go in and subjectively identify whether there's good learning going on. And that's, in many ways, overcomes, to some degree, the issues of, what the aims of history are.
I think what I would be saying is, I do think there is scope, clearly, whether there's change or not, for teachers to be more creative with the curriculum and to try and link it much more to the needs of their children. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope that you've understood clearly the notion that there is really a new relationship between Ofsted and schools, and between history inspectors and history departments, that it really is about self-evaluation. Ofsted, in a sense, is marginal. I'm not saying we're not important, but the really crucial thing is that you're doing it for your own schools, your own departments, your own pupils.